Remain firm in position without it being tight. Now, if these khuffain or if these leather socks have these three conditions, then it will be permissible for you to do masa over them. However, socks which does not have these three conditions or criteria, then it would not be permissible for you to do masa over them. So we mentioned in last week, such as doing masa over nylon socks or cotton socks or some other kind of socks which is very thin and which does not possess the three conditions I've just mentioned now, then it would not be permissible for a person to do masa over them. And then afterwards, I mentioned a couple of rulings with regards to masa al-khuffain. I mentioned that the masa period, which incidentally for a muqim, for a resident, is for 24 hours, and for a musafir and a traveler for 72 hours, starts or begins from the moment you break your wudu after you put on your socks and your khuffain. So if you, say for example, put on your leather socks at 10 a.m. in the morning, and then 4 hours later at 2 p.m. in the afternoon you broke your wudu, so your 24-hour period or your 72-hour period will start from 2 p.m. It doesn't start from the moment you put on your socks or your khuffain, but it starts from the moment you break your wudu after you put on your leather socks. And then the last masla I mentioned before we finished and wrapped up last week's lesson was that if a khuf or a leather sock is ripped or is teared to such an extent that the area equivalent to 3 small toes are exposed, then it would not be permissible to do masa over that particular khuf or over that particular sock, but instead you need to get another one. And just for example, if it is teared to such an extent and a person does masa over it, then his masa or his wiping over the socks will not be considered valid, and therefore the respective ruling will not apply in that particular situation. Now we're going to continue with this particular section by looking at some of the rulings. And some of the rulings I've already kind of briefly explained in passing in last week's lesson. Now the author of the book, Imam Quduri rahmatullah alayh, he begins by saying, وَيَنْقُضُ الْمَسْحَ مَا يَنْقُضُ الْوُضُوءَ, i.e. those things which breaks your wudu also breaks your masa as well. So just say for example, you put on a pair of leather socks, khuffain, you did wudu before, and then while you've had this khuffain on or these leather socks on, what happened was that your wudu broke. Now when your wudu breaks, whether it could be through bleeding, through vomiting, or going to your toilet, or so on and so forth, then what happens is that your masa also breaks as well. So therefore what you need to do is, in that situation, you will have to redo your wudu again, but there's no need for you to remove your khuffain or your leather socks, but instead what you will do is, on top of the khuffain, you will just do masa over it, you will just wipe or pass wet hands over it, and your khuffain will be intact for the next period. So that is the ruling here, that things which breaks the wudu also breaks your masa as well. And then the next ruling goes on to say, وَيَنْقُضُهُ أَيْضًا نَزْعُ الْخُفِّ, that similarly, removing a khuf or a leather sock also breaks your masa as well. So just for example, you've got your leather socks on, but during that 24-hour period, what you do is that you take it off. Now in that situation, what will happen is that your masa is now broken. So therefore what you have to do in this situation will be, is that you just wash your feet, you take the other khuf off, you take the other leather sock off, you wash your feet, and then you put the khuffain back on. and there's no need for you to repeat the wuzu. I mentioned this in a bit detail last week, and I mentioned that because the actual removing of the hoof of the actual leather sock, that doesn't break your wuzu. That's not considered as nullifiers of wuzu. That's not considered as nawaqid of wuzu. So therefore, when you remove the hoof or the leather sock, then what happens is that your masa finishes or your masa breaks, but there's no need for you to repeat the wuzu all over again. What you do, just go to the wuzu area, or if you're at home, you just go to the sink, wash your feet, put your khuffayn back on, and that's it. The next time you then break the wuzu, the 24-hour period or 72-hour period will start. And similarly, the author mentions وَمُضِيُّ الْمُدَّةِ, that when the time passes, then automatically your masa period will also finish as well. So that is simple. Just say, for example, going back to our earlier example, that just say if you put on your leather socks at 10 a.m. in the morning, and then at 2 p.m. you broke your wuzu. So the 24 hours will start from 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Now the following day at 2 p.m., what will happen is at 2 p.m. exactly, your masa will break. Now again, when your masa breaks at 2 p.m. the following day, if you are already in the state of wudu, just say for example you've already read your Zuhur Salah and you're in the state of wudu, then in that situation, there's no need for you to repeat the wudu again. Instead, you will wash your feet, and if you don't want to put your leather socks on and just want to wear normal socks, then wash your feet, wear your normal socks, or just leave it barefooted if you want, and you will still be considered to be in the state of wudu. And if you do want to put on your leather socks back on again, then again wash your feet, put on your leather socks, and then the next time you break the wuzu, the 24-hour period will start. What I'm trying to kind of stress here in these two rulings is that if you remove your khuffayn, your leather socks, or if the time passes, your wuzu doesn't break. You don't have to repeat the whole wuzu again. And the reason why I'm stressing on it is that a lot of people make this mistake here. They think that when the 24-hour period finishes, then I have to redo my wuzu again. So what happens is that they go to the wuzu area, they do wuzu all over again, and then they will put their khuffayn on. Whereas there is a leeway and there is some concession from the Sharia here. And you should remember that whatever the Sharia has given you concession, you should always take it. And another good example I'll give is regarding qasr, or when you are traveling. So it's a concession from the Sharia that when you are traveling, you shouldn't read 4 rakats of Zuhr, you shouldn't read 4 rakats of Asr and Isha, but instead you should read 2 rakats. But sometimes what happens is that when you are traveling with some people, they want to be religious whilst traveling. They say, no, I want to read 4 rakats. I want to read 4 rakats of Zuhr and Asr. So your assumption in that situation is wrong, because the Sharia is giving you concession. It's telling you to read 2 rakats. So exactly here as well, the Sharia is giving you the concession, and it's saying that, look, there's no need for you to repeat the wuzu, so therefore you should act upon this Shari'i ruling. There's no need for you to repeat the wuzu. You just wash your feet, you put it back on again, and then the next time you break your wuzu, the next 24-hour cycle will start, or if you are a traveler, the next 72-hour period will start. And this is something which the author himself, he mentioned, that فَإِذَا مَضَتِ الْمُدَّةُ نَزَعَ خُفَّيْهِ, that when the muddat finishes, so the 24-hour period finishes, muddat here means the time, so when the muddat and the time finishes, then what should that person do? نَزَعَ خُفَّيْهِ, he should remove his leather socks. وَغَسَلَ رِجْلَيْهِ, and he should just wash his feet. وَصَلَّى, and he should pray. وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ إِعَادَةُ بَقِيَّةِ الْوُضُوءِ, and there's no need for him to repeat the whole wuzu again. So even the author is saying this as well, that to remove the socks, then that if you remove it accidentally or the time period finishes, there's no need for you to start to do the wuzu all over again. Just take it off, wash your feet, put it back on again, start your salah, normally, and the next time you break your wuzu, the next period will start. The next text is an example, is a scenario which the author is mentioning, It's a very straightforward text. The author mentions that وَمَنِ ابْتَدَعَ الْمَسْحَ وَهُوَ مُقِيمٌ فَسَافَرَ قَبْلَ تَمَامِ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ مَسَحَ تَمَامَ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ وَلَيَالِيهَا, which basically means that a person, he started the masah period وَهُوَ مُقِيمٌ, and he was a muqim and a resident. So as I mentioned before, that if you happen to be a muqim, if you happen to be a resident within your area and your city, then the masah period lasts for 24 hours. So this person, say for example, 10 a.m. in the morning, he put on his leather socks. At 2 p.m. in the afternoon, he broke his wudu. So his 24-hour clock has started. Then what happens? Before one day and one night can finish, or before the passing of 24 hours, what happens is that this person, he then decides to travel. He then decides to become a musafir. He then decides to, say, go to London, go to Manchester, or go somewhere. Now the author is saying that in that situation, such an individual will do masah now of 3 days and 3 nights. Meaning, what I'm trying to say here is that in this situation, the period now will be lengthened all the way up to 72 hours. There's no need for you to start the clock all over again, but instead what will happen is that from 2 p.m. in that afternoon, or from that afternoon, we will add another 72 hours on, and the masah now will last until 3 days later at 2 p.m. And the same ruling also, but this is the other way around, where the author says that وَمَنِ ابْتَدَعَ الْمَسْحَ وَهُوَ مُسَافِرٌ, that somebody is traveling. He's in London, he's in Manchester, he's in Scotland, he's in the motorway, say for example. So he's traveling and he puts on, or he starts his masah. So just for example, he puts on his leather socks at 10 a.m. in the morning, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, he breaks his wudu. So 2 p.m. in the afternoon, when he breaks his wudu, he's traveling. He's on the motorway, he stopped over a service station, he's somewhere outside his hometown. Now in that situation, there's a 72-hour clock running for this individual. Now what happens is, this person on that day, he returns home. He returns back to his homeland or his hometown. Now there's two things we need to ask yourself, or two things to look at here. The first thing we look at is that if this individual has returned home, has returned to England, or to Birmingham or whatever, before 24 hours. So just say he was traveling today, at 2 p.m. he was a musafir and traveler when he broke his wuzu, so the 72-hour clock started today at, say on a Saturday, at 2 p.m. But before 24 hours could finish, i.e. before the following day 24 hours, what happened was that this person, he now returns home. He now becomes a muqim. So the masla, or the answer to in that situation will be, is that because he has now become a muqim before 24 hours, so however many hours are left, he will now complete it. So, if, say for example, this person, he returned home at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. So because his masah period was until 2 o'clock, so what will he do is that he will just continue all the way until 2 p.m. in the afternoon. However, if he was to return home, back to his hometown, and the 24-hour period had already elapsed, because remember, he's a traveler, so he was for 72 hours, but by the time he returns home and so on, then the 24-hour period has already elapsed. So in that situation, what will he do is, as mentioned in the text, that this person, he will take off his leather socks and he will just do masah, he will then wash his feet and do masah from the beginning. So that is the ruling here, that فَإِذْ كَانَ مَسَحَ يَوْمًا وَلَيْلَ أَكْثَرَ أَوْ أَكْثَرَ لَزِمَهُ نَزْعُ خُفَّيْهِ. When he returns home, if it's already over 24 hours, then in that situation he will have to take his leather socks off. وَإِنْ كَانَ أَقَلَّ مِنْهُ مَسَحَ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَ أَتَمَّ مَسَحَ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَ. However, if it's less than 24 hours, then he could still continue until the 24-hour period finishes, then he could take off his leather socks. The next ruling here is something which I've already kind of discussed, or I've already mentioned in great detail in last week's lesson. But there's a few things, in particular the miscellaneous rulings or Quduri rulings that is known as in Arabic, which we need to look at in this particular section. And the author begins by saying that according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَسْحُ عَلَى الْجَوْرَبَيْنِ, that it is not permissible to do masa, i.e. to wipe wet hands over jawrabain, over non-leather socks. So if you remember in last week's lesson I went to a bit detail and I mentioned that it is not permissible to do masa over non-leather socks. You are only allowed to do masa over leather socks, over khuffayn. And what is khuffayn? I mentioned the three conditions earlier. But you can't do masa over non-leather socks. Now obviously some may argue and say, well, there are hadiths which say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over non-leather socks. So I gave the reply to each hadith and what the muhaddithin have said with regards to that particular issue and to that particular aspect. Now just a couple of contemporary issues to look at here. The first issue here is something which you can actually get in the markets and in the shops and on Amazon and all these places, is something which is known as seal skins. And you may have seen pictures of it on the internet, but the best way to describe seal skins or Grow-Tech socks is it just looks like a normal cotton sock. From the picture to me it seemed like it was looked like a normal cotton sock. But when you actually do a bit of tahqiq and investigation, even though it may look like a normal cotton sock, but the three conditions which needs to be found for something to be called khuffayn, thus you can do masa over it, these three conditions can also be found on a seal skin socks or Grow-Tech socks. The three conditions such as it being waterproof, such as it being possible for you to walk for 3 miles or more, and that it can stay, or it stays on your feet without it being tied with an elastic or something like that, then these three conditions can be found on a seal skin sock. If you check the internet, if you see some pictures, you'll see that the way it's shaped, it's like Wellington boots basically, but it's a more kind of like a thinner and a smaller version of that. So it's not like you have to, like, especially like the normal cotton socks which we wear, obviously there's elastic in there which actually then keeps it firm. But these are like just like a mini size Wellington boot where you put your feet in and it actually stays there firm by itself. It's really thick and also it is waterproof as well. So because these three conditions are found, so it is permissible for you to do masa over them. Another question is, one of the brothers mentioned last week, is another type of khuf you could say, or another type of sandal you could say, where you may have seen some people wearing it that they've got their normal nylon socks or they're wearing their normal cotton socks. But what they've got is that underneath they've got this kind of, like you could say, a small kind of pouch or a sandal made out of leather which kind of covers the sole. Okay, so it's like you could say a sandal, but obviously without the strings in between, which is just covering the socks from getting it dirty and so on. Now with regards to those, again you need to ask yourself whether the three conditions with regards to khuffayn can be found on them or not. And the first condition was that it has to be waterproof. And we can see that that particular sandal or that particular pouch, it's only protecting the bottom part, but it's not protecting the upper part of your nylon socks. And obviously what would happen is that if I was to then put some water on top of the cotton socks, then the water will seep into the socks and obviously go into my teeth. So therefore, those kind of like sandals or those kind of pouches which covers the cotton socks, protects it from getting dirty and messy, then you won't be able to do masa on them. It's more like a kind of a protection, you could say, especially if you're wearing white socks to stop it getting dirty. It's more like kind of a protection than actually being a khuffain where you could actually, where it's waterproof, where it actually, sticks onto your feet or something like that. It's more like protecting your socks than actually using it as a khuf and as a fabric, you could say, in walking or something like that. So that will be the answer to that particular question. And if we have a look at the text, it also says that it's not permissible to do masa al-jawrabain over non-leather socks unless illa ay yakuna mujalladain aw muna'alain. So Imam Hanif rahmatullah is saying that unless if these normal socks or non-leather socks have mujallad. Mujallad means that it's got, mujallad muna'al more or less means the same thing, that is that unless it's got leather or some kind of skin or some kind of skin of a hard animal, say for example, fitted into the non-leather socks. So just say for example, you've got your normal socks here, like this, you could call it jawrab in, like obviously even those cotton socks, but Arabic you call it jawrab. So if underneath the socks you've got some kind of like leather soles, say put at the top, put at the bottom and so on, covering the whole cotton socks, making sure that no kind of water goes inside, then in that situation, Imam Abu Hanif rahmatullah says that you can do masasa. So you got your normal socks, but what you've done is that you kind of padded the whole socks with leather, or you kind of padded it with like herds of animals or skins of animals and or cattle, these kind of like hard skins. You kind of padded that socks or cotton socks, then in that situation you'll be able to do masa on them. Whereas Sahibain, i.e. Imam Yusuf, Imam Muhammad rahmatullah says, وَقَالَ يَجُوزُ إِذَا كَانَ السَّقِينَيْن لَا يَشْفِيَانِ, i.e. that you can do masa on non-leather socks as long as it is sakhinain. Sakhinain means thick and it is not waterproof. So that kind of fits in what I mentioned before, because if a non-leather sock, if it is thick, just imagine that you got wearing this a special brand of non-leather socks where it is really thick, it actually prevents water from seeping inside. You can actually walk continuously for 3 miles, and that if it's firmly stuck onto your feet, then it will be permissible for you to do masa on them. So, for example, sometimes you could get these kind of really thick cotton socks, like really thick. What I mean really thick, like really thick it is, and it's so thick that water can't seep through. It's so thick that you can actually walk with it for 3 miles or more, and it is such that it actually stays firm on your feet. So if these 3 conditions are found on a non-leather sock, then you can do masa on it. But very rarely these 3 conditions will be found. But just as an example, if a manufacturer or someone in the future makes these kind of socks, or like the one I mentioned, seal skin, then it will be permissible to do masa on them. But generally speaking, normal cotton socks or nylon socks, because they don't possess these 3 conditions, in particular the first one, that they are not waterproof, so therefore it would not be permissible for someone to do masa over them. The next few rulings with regards to this particular section, the author mentions وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَسْحُ عَلَى الْإِمَامَةِ وَالْقَلَنْسُوَةِ وَالْبُرْقَ وَالْقُفَّازَةِ, that it is not permissible to do masa or to wipe wet hands عَلَى الْإِمَامَةِ over the turban. Similarly, وَالْقَلَنْسُوَةِ, and also over the topi or the hat, وَالْبُرْقَ, and also over the veil and the burqa, وَالْقُفَّازَيْن, and also over gloves. So basically there are 4 things which you cannot do masa over. You can't do masa over your turban. Now you may be thinking that the same way Allah has said that, or the same way, it's mentioned in the hadith that if you can't wash your feet for some reason, then if you do masa over leather socks, then that is sufficient. So some may argue and some may be thinking, well, it's quite difficult to take off my turban, I might as well just do masa over my turban. Or it's quite difficult for me to remove my hat, I might as well do masa over my hat. Or it's a bit difficult for a woman or for a sister to remove her veil, so let her just do masa over her headscarf or over her veil. Or it may be difficult for someone to remove his gloves, in particular when it's really cold, so instead of washing his two hands up to his wrists as we do at the beginning of the wudu, then he might as well just do masa over them. So the ruling, the author comprehensively saying is that no, it's not permissible to do masa over these things. Now I mentioned it last week, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran is very clear when He mentioned the procedure of wudu. And He mentioned that you have to wash your face, you have to wash your arms up to your elbows, you have to do masa over your head, and you have to wash your feet up to your ankles. So it's really, really clear what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned. Now, unless there is a strong evidence or a strong proof which tells us otherwise, then we can move away from the Quranic verse and act upon that strong verse, i.e. the hadith. And I explained last week that with regards to the issue of doing masa over leather socks, that more than 80 companions have narrated hadiths that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over khuffain and over leather socks. So because of that reason, because of there being a sheer number of narrations and riwayah, what we've done is that we've kind of moved away from that particular Quranic verse, and we say that, okay, at the time of necessity or whenever a person, like for example, if it's really cold, or whenever, it doesn't have to be any necessity, but whenever, if he wants to do masa over leather socks, then it will be permissible. Now I'm not denying, and I'm not saying that, or there aren't hadiths where it mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over his turban. I'm not saying that. They are hadiths. But the hadiths where it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over his turban, there are only one or two hadiths. And these one or two hadiths, when it comes to hadith terminology, is known as a khabre wahid. Like only one or two people have narrated such hadiths. And a khabre wahid, you cannot use the khabre wahid to alter or change a Quranic verse. Because only one or two people have narrated the hadiths, so it's not as strong, it doesn't have that much force or that much strength in those narrations and in those riwayah. So therefore you can't use those hadiths to alter and change the verses of the Holy Quran. Now the hadiths which are mentioned, there is a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari where it's narrated that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over his turban. Now the answer to that particular hadith, or the reply to that particular hadith, is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over his turban when he was already in the state of wudu. That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was already in the state of wudu, but he was repeating his wudu. So therefore, what he did was that he was washing his face, he was washing his arms, and because he was already in the state of wudu, there was no need for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to go into any hassle and remove his turban. But instead, he just did masa over it and he washed his feet. Similarly, some of the scholars have said that the hadith is when he says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did masa over his turban, is that the turban was so thin that the water reached the hair below the turban. That the turban of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was thin, the hat which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was wearing was thin, that when he actually did masa over the turban, the water seeped through the hat and onto the blessed hair of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So therefore, that's the reply which the Hanafi scholars have given, and also other Imams have given as well, to show that just by doing masa over the turban, you would not be considered as that you've done masa over your head. But instead you will have to take your turban off, you will have to take your topi off and do masa over it. And there are other hadiths, like for example, a hadith in Muwatta Imam Muhammad, where once the great Sahabi Sayyidina Jabir bin Abdullah radiallahu anhu was asked by someone that, can we do masa over our turban? So he replied by saying that not with or not without the water touching the head. This was his reply. That somebody asked him, can you do masa over the turban? So he replied by saying, not without the water touching the hair. I.e., you can do it, but you have to make sure that the water touches the hair. Because if you don't, and you can't guarantee that the water has touched the hair, then your masa would not be considered valid and accepted. So that's what the text is saying, that you can't do masa over the turban, وَقَلَنْ suwa, you can't do masa over the topi, over the hat. And with regard to the hat and topi, inshallah next week I'll just talk very briefly about the issue of wearing a hat, whether it is a sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam or not. Wal-burqa, you can't do masa over the headscarf, you can't do masa over the beard. And again, there is another hadith also which can be found in the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad rahmatullahi alayhi, that he once mentioned that Nafi', he once saw Safiya bint Abi Ubayd radiallahu anha perform wudu. She pulled her headscarf and wiped her head. The hadith quite clearly saying that a female sahabi in the name of Safiya bint Abi Ubayd, that when she was performing the wuzu, so she removed or she took her headscarf off and then she did masa over the hair. And the next section here, the next masla, the author Imam Quduri rahmatullahi says, وَيَجُوزُ عَلَى الْجَبَائِ, that it is permissible to do masa over plasters or bandages. Now obviously, because bandages and plasters, they're linked with masa al-khuffayn, that's the same way you do masa over leather socks, something which is hard, that is considered as a substitute of washing your feet. So similarly, doing masa over plasters or bandages, that is also considered a substitute of washing. Now just a couple of rulings here which is not mentioned in the book but which needs to be clarified, is that when it comes to doing masa over a bandage or a plaster, it's not necessary to make sure that the whole bandage or the whole plaster is wet. The same way when it comes to the khuffayn, that you don't have to make sure that every area of the leather sock is wet. You don't have to make sure that top part is wet. It's not necessary for the bottom part to be wet. It's not necessary that the heel to be wet and so on. As long as the area which is equivalent to 3 small fingers is wet, then the masa will be done. So the exactly same goes with regard to masa over a bandage or a plaster. So just say, for example, a person, he's broken his arm and his right arm is in a casket. So when he comes to perform wuzu and then namaz, it's not necessary that he has to wet his hand and make sure that all the casket is wet. He doesn't have to make sure of that. But as long as the majority of the casket is wet or is wiped with wet hands, then that will be sufficient. So just an example, what he could do is that his right arm is in a casket, he wets his left hand, and he just like does masa over the top part like this and over the bottom part. Obviously there'll be some areas around his elbows and so on which may be dry, but that doesn't matter. As long as the majority of the casket is wiped, has been wiped over with wet hands, then his masa will be correct and fine. And the same also applies for plasters as well. You don't have to make sure that every single part of the plaster has to be wet. As long as the majority of the plaster is wet or is wiped over with wet hands, then that will be sufficient and that will be okay. Obviously nowadays people, they tend to get like waterproof plasters and so on, so that's even better. So if it's waterproof plaster, you could actually do wuzu, like just actually wet it completely over and it's not going to affect the plaster. Because obviously before the plasters, they were like different, so obviously if you were to wet it too much, then the plaster will come off. But nowadays you get waterproof plaster, so you just wet it as much as you want, it's not going to really affect as long as that area is wet then that is sufficient and that is okay. So the author is saying that it is permissible وَيَجُوزُ عَلَى الْجَبَائِرِ to do masa over a plaster or a bandage. وَإِنْ شَدَّهَا عَلَى غَيْرِ وُضُوء, even though he may have put it on not being in the state of wudu. وَإِنْ شَدَّهَا عَلَى غَيْرِ وُضُوء, even though that he may have put it on not in the state of wudu. Now that is one distinction or one difference between wiping wet hands over your khuffayn and wiping over plasters and bandages, because over the khuffayn I mentioned that you have to be in the state of wudu before, then you put your khuffayn on, then you could do masa. But with regard to plasters and bandages, that is not a prerequisite. I.e., for example, let's say you're bleeding and so on, the Sharia doesn't say, oh, you have to do wudu first and then put on the plaster. No. Even though you may not be in the state of wudu, you can put on your plaster and then afterwards you could, when the time then comes for namaz or anything which requires wudu, then afterwards you can do masa over it. So that is the text here that وَإِنْ شَدَّهَا عَلَى غَيْرِ وُضُوء, that even though he may have put you on, not being in the state of wudu. And the last ruling here before we finish, the author mentioned فَإِنْ سَقَطَتْ مِنْ غَيْرِ بُرْءٍ لَمْ يَبْطُلِ الْمَسْحُ وَإِنْ سَقَطَتْ عَنْ بُرْءٍ بَطَلَ. A very important ruling here. The author from this particular text is highlighting or is indicating to something very important. And that is that sometimes what may happen is that the plaster in particular which we are wearing, it may come off. Now if the plaster comes off and if the wound is still there, meaning that the wound hasn't healed, it's still kind of bleeding, it's still kind of like reddish, you could still see that it hasn't properly healed. So in that situation, your wuzu will remain intact. I.e., what you do is that you just put another plaster on, your wuzu is intact and you can continue your namaz. If you are already, say, in the masjid, there's no need for you to repeat your wuzu, but instead you could start your namaz. However, just say for example, you were wearing a plaster and the plaster came off and the wound which was there, which you used the plaster to cover, that has now healed. The cut which was there before, that's why you put the plaster on, the cut has already healed. Now if the cut has healed, then in that situation, you won't be able to read namaz. And if you do read namaz, your namaz is not going to be accepted if you do not wash that area. So without washing that area, you won't be able to read your namaz. And if you do read your namaz is going to be accepted. Okay, so it's a very important ruling here. So you've had a cut, you've got a bandage, or just say like after a couple of days, naturally, when you think that it's kind of healed, you tend to peel it off yourself. So you peel the plaster off. So if the wound or the cut has properly healed, nothing there at all, then what will you now, if remember this is obviously in the state of wudu, what you will have to do is that you will have to at least wash that area. You don't have to redo your wudu all over again, but the very least, the minimum is you have to wash that area and then start your namaz or read namaz. Because if you don't, and you just carry on as normal, and your wuzu will not be accepted, your namaz will not be accepted. So this is what the author is saying, that فَإِنْ سَقَطَتْ مِنْ غَيْرِ بُرْءٍ, that if the plaster fell off, مِنْ غَيْرِ بُرْءٍ, without it healing, لَمْ يَبْطُلِ الْمَسْ, the masa over the plaster, over the jabira would not break. I.e., saying that you could still continue with your ibadat, you could still continue with your wuzu because your wuzu is intact. However, وَإِنْ سَقَطَتْ عَنْ بُرْءٍ بَطَلَ, however, if the plaster fell off and it has healed, so in that situation, batala, your masa which you had done over that area is now batil, is now annulled, and therefore you will have to wash that area. You don't have to redo your wuzu all over again, but what you have to do is that you should just wash that area and then start your namaz. So that is the last ruling with regards to this section of wiping wet hands over the khuffayn and the leather socks. Inshallah, the next week's section will be based on Babul Hayd. Hayd basically means periods or menses of women. Very important topic, similar to what we looked at before with regards to ejaculation and ghusl and so on. So this is basically the woman's side now. So obviously we'll be looking at menses and obviously different types of childbirth, bleeding, istihaza, which is known as, and there's also a very important ruling with regards to those who are ma'zur. Ma'zur are basically those who may have problems, or it could be menses as well, who may have problems of urine or gas problems, so they're always releasing gas, they're always releasing urine. So question arises that how would they read namaz and keep their wuzu? So this is something inshallah which we will look at and discuss in next week's session.